Hello everybody. My name is Afton Branche-Wilson, and I am the Strategic Projects Manager at Poverty Solutions. Specifically, I'm on the Detroit team. So I live in Detroit, and all my work is focused on Detroit. So I'm going to talk for a little bit, about 10, 15 minutes about me and kind of my current role and how I got here. Then I'm going to show you a couple of things that I do in my work, and then we'll have some questions at the end. So first, my current role. So basically, Poverty Solutions has a partnership with the City of Detroit, where we assist city officials and community agencies on research to reduce poverty. So that's kind of our big umbrella. And what that means is a lot of times we're answering questions. So a community group might want to know, how are Detroiters doing financially? And so we will write a paper or collect data to help answer that question. And then we will come up with recommendations to improve on what we're finding. Another thing that we do is we will evaluate current programs. So the City of Detroit is in the middle of an initiative to improve rental housing. There's a lot of very old rental housing in the city. And we were finding that, landlords weren't really doing their part in terms of keeping up with their properties. So the city passed a law to crack down on landlords who are not improving their properties. But they came to us to understand, is this law working? Are landlords actually improving their properties? And if not, were evictions increasing? So we use data to answer those questions. So that's kind of big picture what we do. And then for me, I'm working on various projects at any one time. So I think with this job, you kind of have to, you're moving from one thing to another, your head's on a swivel. You're not just doing one thing for, 40 hours a week. There's lots of little projects that you're kind of jumping in between, which I really like. I love jumping in between projects. So that's one thing I like about this job. And so I've been here for a year. Before that, I worked at Detroit City Council. I worked for a city council member. And in that role, I did a lot of community engagement and community relations. So I would go to community meetings. I would talk to residents on the phone to understand what do you need from your city and how can we help connect you to programs and services. So, usually it was older folks would kind of call me and say, hey, there's a pothole outside my house, or hey, my neighbors are being loud. Hey, the trash isn't being picked up. And so my job was to say, okay, where do you live? What's your phone number? And then give them a list of things that they can do to address those issues. And that was really fun, sometimes frustrating, but really fun, because it was a way to really understand, at like a really neighbor by neighbor level, what is going on in the city and how the city could better help residents. So I did a lot of casework basically with residents to help resolve some of their community issues. And then also my job was to think about trends and share those with my boss, who's the council member. So if I was noticing that, for example, 15 people had the same issue with the same trash contractor, part of my job was to notice that and pass that on to the council member. Sorry, that's male, I think. Part of my job was to pass that on to the council member so that she could then have a meeting with the trash contractor to say, hey, these residents are noticing this thing is going on. You need to improve what's happening. So it was really kind of on a super micro level, trying to figure out what's happening, but then making sure those issues were being translated at the macro level to policymakers and to government. So I did that role for 2 years, and it was really my first kind of direct service type job, really working with clients, working with customers, so to speak. And I found that to be really, really useful and really powerful, because, when you're working to reduce poverty, big picture, that's what we do at Poverty Solutions. You also want to have a sense of what residents want, and you want to have a sense of what they're talking about and what they actually care about. And for me, the best way to do that is by talking to residents. So that's really what I got from that role at council. I'm going back in time here. So doing Poverty Solutions now, council. Before that, I was a grad student at University of Michigan. I got my master's in public policy at the Ford School. And I learned a lot there about economics, about statistics, and about measuring social programs. That's kind of the specialty of that school, trying to understand what do you need to measure to know whether a social program is working or not working. And that's really important for a couple of reasons. One, usually there's not unlimited resources at a city or a nonprofit, and you need to know, okay, we're spending $1 million on this program. Is it actually delivering what we promised to residents that it's delivering? So evaluation and statistics is one way to do that. It's not just about money, right? The other reason that we do anything in politics or in government is to make sure we're delivering impact and improving people's lives. So if we don't measure, we don't know whether that's working either. So for me, going to grad school was a way to kind of build up those skills and just spend more time kind of learning about how public policy works. And so that's my specialty is public policy, which is very broad. It kind of means everything, everything that you see around you, the roads, your schools, whether your lighting on your street is turned on or not. Public policy has a role to play there and kind of reaches into that. So do elections, unfortunately. Most people don't like elections, but that's how you get your policymakers, right? So, learning about politics and about how politics impacts policy is another piece of what I learned in school. And of course, we can see this now, right? One governor may have a different way of addressing COVID versus another governor. And sometimes it has to do with their politics, but it also affects their policy decisions. We can talk about more about that in Q&A, but that's another thing that we sort of learned in policy school. There are things in in a book that you might choose to be a great policy, but if the politics makes it difficult for you to actually choose that, then you have to adjust. So I was in grad school for 2 years. Before that, I worked in New York City for 6 years in various nonprofit organizations. I worked on immigration policy, where I did research and writing, and then I worked for an international nonprofit where I helped community organizations connect to volunteers. So yeah, I've mostly worked in the nonprofit and government sector, and that's what I went to undergrad for as well. I studied politics and policy at the undergrad level at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. So I've been a lot of places. I've lived in DC, New York. I'm here in Michigan now. I grew up in California and Cleveland. So I've been all over the place. But I think for me, kind of the through line in all of my career is sort of public service and public policy. That's kind of what I've tried to do all along. So that's kind of what I've been doing. I guess a couple of things I've learned for my career journey so far. I would say first is to really get an understanding of what you like to do when you sit down to work. So for me, I know I like to work with people. I know I like clients. I know I like projects that have some sort of public facing element to it. My very first job in New York, I was a researcher, but I didn't interact with people at all. And so I didn't like it. I wasn't happy. I was literally sitting at a computer. I didn't go to public meetings. I didn't talk to residents. And so I found I was not really engaged because it didn't give me kind of the thing I needed to be motivated. So once I realized that, I made sure that every job I had after that had some sort of public component. I got to work with people and I got to work with clients in some way. So I think, and as I'm talking to some of my friends now, we're all kind of realizing the same thing. Do you like to sit and look at numbers? Do you like to write? Do you like to sell things? Trying to figure out what's the thing that kind of keeps you motivated besides, having a paycheck. That's also motivation, of course, but what keeps you excited about, going to work? So that's one thing I realized. And the other thing is that you can't always plan where you're going to go. My first organization went out of business. This was in the 2009 recession. I was at a nonprofit and it went out of business. And so, I had 3 months to find a new job. And they were like, this is it, you have to go. So I really had to figure out, how am I going to pay my bills, but also how can I find something quickly that I still will be engaged in, will still like. And, I didn't plan for that at all, but I think now that I've had that experience, always having in the back of your head, the job you have may go away. So having some sort of plan B is always important, whether that's savings, whether that's just keeping your eyes open for other organizations that you like, I think is an important kind of career practice. Yeah, so I'll stop there. Should we do questions now or at the end? How do you want to organize it, Dave?
Whatever is more comfortable for you, in what you prefer question-wise. So I know a lot, like some people will answer a question and that's a 10-minute answer, and other people will answer a question and it's like a quick thing. So honestly, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, I'll answer some questions now because I think the second piece is just, there'll probably be others have to question. So I want to make sure people, have time to ask about career stuff if needed. So yeah, if there's any questions, I will stop now.
Absolutely.
And if not, that's okay too.
Hunter, I've known you long enough now to know that I can tell you've got a question.
Or a comment, maybe.
I'm just trying to figure out how to word it properly.
That's all right. This is a combo, so you can just brainstorm your way to a question.
You said you had your master's in public policy from Michigan, but then you also mentioned that you're or sort of interested in, or at least you've worked in immigration affairs, and then also I read that, and I think you also mentioned that you're also about like gender equality and stuff like that. So policy, I'm trying, how do I word this? Is like public policy a good like way to incorporate both of those items into what you work with? Or is that something just like how you said public policy is sort of a overview or like is so adaptable to many career paths? Would it be more in like someone's interest if they did public policy to then just focus in on one of those areas? Or have you worked both of those into like your career path now in a, I guess, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, public policy is very broad, both in terms of what you're studying in school. So I kind of like to think of it as, a lot of people who are interested in business, they'll get a master's in business administration, and it's a really broad overview of all the things related to business. So you'll do finance, accounting, etc. A master's in public policy is the same thing, just for the public sector. So you get a really broad overview of all the things that go into governance, into nonprofit work, into economics. But I think in terms of your issue area interests, which for me would be immigration, gender issues, and poverty, you get to kind of work that in your electives in school. So at Michigan, I took electives in kind of the issue areas I thought were interesting, while I was still getting kind of a broad education in overall public policy, if that makes sense. And same with your career. So you might work at an organization that specializes in immigration policy or in women's rights, or you might work for the government, which is usually quite broad. When you're working for a city council member, you can't only serve immigrants, you can't only serve women, right? So you're working on things that affect lots of people. And I think the way that you can control what you work on is through kind of what types of organizations you're working in. So I know some people who only do education policy. So that's the only type of organization they work in is only education policy. So it might be a nonprofit, they might work at a school, or they might work at the school district. And that's how they're able to do public policy, but stick to a really specific focus along the way. I didn't really take that path. I'm kind of interested in a lot of different things. And I realized actually early on doing immigration policy that I liked seeing how lots of different things fit into together. So I didn't want to just specialize in one area, but a lot of people love that. And that's kind of the path that they take. Does that make sense?
It does, because it says when you went to Michigan, you focused on like nonprofit management, community planning, and stuff like that. And I realized that all of those sort of entangle with each other when figuring out your career path and stuff like that, with like immigration and the stuff you focus on. And you mentioned how you sort of like all of them and figure out how they work together, which is more like something that I'm interested in. I don't think I could focus on one thing for my hours at a time. And
yeah. Or years, right? I mean, I think something I've heard from older folks is like, you have a lot of years to be in a career, so you can kind of shift courses and still stay in the same theme along the way, and that's natural. Right, in the chat, what made me do public policy? Like, what interested me? That's a really good question. So in 8th grade, I had this teacher, and he he has choose a country and read news articles about one country all year. And that got me interested in international politics and international public policy, which is what I went to undergrad for. So really, I just had an interest in kind of how international stuff, so to speak, really early on, and that's what I wanted to go to undergrad for. And I think what attracted me to it was the element of like public service. I think that's my dad's a doctor, and my grandma, she was a kindergarten teacher, and so they both were kind of public servants in various ways, and so that always kind of inspired me in my work, just kind of helping people. Really, that's the thought, right? And so public policy is, to me, how you do that on a bigger scale. It's not service work in the way that, you know, being a teacher or a doctor is, but for me, it's kind of a way to make sure that the systems around teachers and doctors work well for people. So yeah, I was really kind of a thread that I followed early on. I kind of moved away from being interested in international work when I realized you had to live internationally for a long time to be successful in that career. And I realized, well, I don't want to live away from my family and my country, so maybe that's not the career for me. I had that realization not long ago, so that's something that I was still working out in undergrad or in grad school as well. But yeah, I think that was the interest. And I think also internships helped me dig into that a little more. In college, I interned for a women's rights nonprofit. I really loved what they did. And so I think doing kind of internships or volunteer experiences help you like test out stuff that you might like. I wish I had actually done more of those. But the ones I did, I found that it helped me understand, you know, do I like the kind of work that's happening? Do I like the culture? Do I like the people around me and kind of what they get excited about? So I think internships and volunteer opportunities are really good ways to help you figure out like what you're interested in, if you don't already know. Okay, I'm looking at, it's 11:20 now. So why don't I shift to the kind of shadowing part, and feel free to throw out questions in the chat for me to address at the end. So I'm going to share my screen. Well, let me first explain kind of what I'm going to show you. So like I said at the beginning, part of what we do at Poverty Solutions is we're working with city agencies, we're working with community organizations to answer questions, and usually that involves providing recommendations about policies or programs that they should enact. So one way we figure out what to recommend is to research what other smart people have said already works. So researching books, reading articles, trying to understand, you know, let's say we want to make sure that as many people get food stamps as possible in Michigan. Well, what did they do in Illinois? How did they address that issue? That's one way that we go at our research. Another way is to learn from the community what they would like to see recommended to policymakers. And so we do that in two ways. One is through surveys, and that's numerical data. And another way is through focus groups, which is talking to people and getting their stories and getting qualitative data. So that's a big part of my job. I'm going to show you kind of two different ways that that we do that at Poverty Solutions. So let me share my screen. Okay. You guys see my screen? It's a Zoom right now. Okay. So we do a survey of Detroit residents called the Detroit Metro Area Community Study. And it's basically a survey, an opinion survey of about 1,200 residents. And we ask them lots of different questions in different issue areas. So we ask about transportation, health, race, crime and policing, all these different things to really understand from residents, you know, what are you experiencing in your neighborhoods and what are your priorities for change? So I'm going to show you one way that I analyze data to help sort of answer questions. Here's where the survey data is. You can kind of explore it on your own if you're interested. Here's what a survey kind of reported out looks like. This tells you how many people took the survey, and then you can see all the different questions and answers. So I already pulled up some. Can you see this Excel, or do I have to share a different screen?
We're still seeing the PDF of it.
Okay. Maybe I'll stop sharing and then share a different screen. There we go. Okay. So I downloaded some data from the DMAX survey, and the question that I downloaded was, what are residents' top 3 priorities for neighborhood change? So let's say I'm a council member and I'm trying to figure out, you know, what should I be advocating for in the budget cycle? Like, what do residents want me to be advocating for? So here's one way you might start to get an answer to that question. So in this question, the survey asked residents to pick their top 3 priorities for neighborhood change. And so on the right, you're seeing percentages. And this tells you what percent of residents, no, it's not 1,000%. This tells you what percent of residents put this in their priorities for change. So as you can see here, the top priority for change is reducing crime, followed by fixing up or tearing down houses that are in poor condition. In Detroit, we have a lot of abandoned and vacant houses that don't look great. People don't want them to be there. Some of them are dangerous. And so this is probably why this is so high. So if I were sharing this information to a policymaker, I wouldn't really want to share it like this. This isn't very engaging, and it doesn't tell an obvious story right away. So sometimes what we like to do is we like to visualize data using different charts and kind of graphics. So I'm going to do that. One thing that we also like to do is sort it. We don't want the smallest one first. We would want the biggest one first. So I'm going to sort that. And I'm going to do a little graph and play with it to see if we can tell a clearer story with this data. So here's one graph that we could use. I don't like this one because you can't really see what the priorities are. They're slanted, so you can't see what exactly people want, which is the whole point of this. So I'm not going to use that one, even though Excel recommended it. Instead, I'm going to do a bar chart. That way you can see, if I make it big enough, you can see most of the statements here. So for this one, that one's too long. I probably would change that a little bit. But for this purpose, I'm going to leave it alone. So right now we notice that it starts with skipped and missing first. That's not the most interesting data to show first, and that's where the person's eye goes. So I'm going to take that out. We don't want skipped or missing in there anymore. And then I'm also going to sort it, I did it already, but I'm going to sort it largest to smallest. And then I'm going to refresh it. Let's see if I can do this while also sharing my screen. Oops. Oh, the button I'm looking for is hidden by, let me move it over here for a second. So one thing when you're doing visualizations, it's helpful to just kind of put yourself in the shoes of who's looking at it. That will help you figure out kind of what to emphasize. All right, I can't figure out how to sort this again while also sharing my screen. But anyway, let's pretend that I put reducing crime first. Other things that I notice on here that I would need to change before giving it to a policymaker, for example, obviously this title doesn't tell us anything, so we would want to rename that. Also, one thing I'm noticing with this graph is that it goes all the way out to 60%, but there are no answers all the way to 60%. So we would probably want to change where this axis goes. Okay, so right here you see it says 60. We're going to make this go out to 50 so that you can see the data a little bit better. And see, it made everything look a little bit longer, and it's just easier to see where the bars go. One major no-no in making graphs and charts is never change the minimum. It should always be 0, because if you change the minimum, it basically distorts what the data says. Sometimes you'll see this on like cable news, or you'll see this on different formats of displaying data, and it doesn't, let me show you an example. So we're starting it at 20, and this makes the data look crazy, right? I mean, this isn't exactly what residents are saying. Usually as humans, we interpret a bar chart from 0. That's how our brains think. So you would never want to change where it starts because it kind of confuses your brain. Even though it might make the data tell a story you want it to, we don't want to do that. Okay, so here's our little bar chart, top 3 priorities for neighborhood change. And so here it's easy to see what the top 3 are. It's affordable housing, fixing up or tearing down houses, and reducing crime. Other things we might want to do to make this a little bit more compelling, we might make these a little bit bigger. We might change these colors of the top 3 to be yellow so that it really jumps out to who's looking at this, this bar chart. We also might want to put it next to, you know, a chart breaking this down by income. Maybe your council member wants to know, what are lower income people, what do they want? And is it different from what higher income people want? And that's actually something that I broke down with this chart. And actually there were some differences by income. For example, and this sounds obvious, but it's important to make sure the data actually confirms what you're thinking. I saw this and I thought, well, okay, creating more affordable housing, about 35% of people put it in their top 3. That seems kind of low, right? And so I looked at, what do people who make under $10,000 a year, what percentage of them put affordable housing in their top 3? It was much higher, which tells you that folks who make less money are having issues affording housing in our city. And so that's something that you might want to emphasize if your council member was really focused on issues related to poverty. So this is an example of how we might use kind of numbers and use survey data to kind of express something to a policymaker or a city official when they're trying to make decisions. And this is a really good way to understand how a lot of people view an issue. I also, another practice that we use at Poverty Solutions is using stories. This tells you what people are interested in, but it doesn't really tell you why, and it doesn't give you more details. So we see here that, you know, a good amount of people want to improve public schools, but what do they want to improve? Why do they want to improve it? What's missing that they would like to see? And you can accomplish that with survey data, but usually someone is not going to sit and answer a survey for an hour, right? They're going to answer a survey that's 10 minutes long, and so there's only so much that you can put in a survey. So I'm going to show you another data collecting practice that I use in my work. So we do a lot of focus groups in Poverty Solutions, and a focus group, for those who aren't familiar, is basically you sit down with a group of folks and kind of ask them questions about their experiences. And so it's usually 8 to 10 people, and you're getting stories. You're not getting a representative sample of the city like a survey, but you're getting more in-depth and richer information. So I did a series of focus groups. Can you see this Word document now? Or is it still on the Excel?
Still on the Excel.
See, I'm not a teacher who's mastered like remote sharing. Okay, so here's the focus group guide. So basically with the focus group, you want 8 to 10 people, and you have about an hour to have a conversation. And so what you're trying to understand in depth is, what do people think about this issue? And how do their life perspectives shape their thinking? That's kind of a general explanation of a focus group. So for this set of focus groups I did last year, I wanted to understand what were residents' barriers and priorities to reducing poverty in Detroit. So what I did was try to figure out what 6 or 7 questions can I ask to get people to sort of answer this and give me kind of rich answers. To get people talking about something like this, you want to make sure that you sort of warm up the group. So you think of a couple of warm-up questions first to really get people practiced talking in a group of 8 to 10 people. Usually the focus group participants don't know each other, so you want to just let them warm up a little bit, have them talk about something that's not controversial, that's super easy. So I started with, how long have you lived in this neighborhood? But then I realized, I did a couple focus groups with that question, and I realized it wasn't really warming people up. People would just say, 20 years, and they would stop. Really with the warm-up, you want a question that will get people talking in a couple of sentences. So I struck that one, and I went with, what's your favorite movie and why? And as you can see, this has nothing to do with our actual theme, but it's something that everyone can answer in an accessible way. And people love talking about movies, I found out. So people would just talk about, I like Pretty Woman because I thought it was a beautiful story, blah, blah, blah. And it really got people kind of warming up and sharing and laughing a little bit. So that was a good warm-up question. And then you kind of go into, the meat of the questions. So you probably wouldn't want to just ask this question because it's a little bit specific. So usually you start with a more general question. So I would say, what does someone need to live a stable life in Detroit? Pretty broad. You can kind of answer it however you want. So that one is able to talk through categories. They would say, education, you need a good family, blah, blah, blah. And then I would do a follow-up question. Okay, so you said someone needs a family to live a stable life. Why is that? Like, tell me more about how families help you live a stable life. And so when you're writing focus group questions, you usually are thinking of the main question, and then you're thinking of, if someone doesn't want to answer it, how would you restate the question to get them to answer the question? Or how do you restate it that's a little bit more accessible? So I might say, let's say you're explaining, what you like about your neighborhood to someone else. What would that be? And the key here is you don't want yes or no questions in a focus group because the idea is to get people talking. So one thing when you're reading this guide, make sure there's no yes or no questions so that people are kind of talking and explaining their experiences. And you always want prompts or follow-ups in case they clam up a little bit. So this is kind of how I would write a focus group guide. Usually you have 6 or 7 questions for an hour. You may not get through all of the questions, and that's okay. If residents want to take the conversation all about education and they don't want to talk about anything else, that's data. That's telling you something. It's telling you that people just want to talk about education because it's top of mind. So you might in the process kind of rewrite or kind of re-brainstorm what you're asking if people just want to go down the education path. A couple of other things that we think about when we're writing a focus group guide is making sure we're not asking 2 questions in one. You want to give people time to digest and think about responding to what you're asking them. So if I were saying, what does someone need to live a stable life and be happy in Detroit? This is 2 questions because if someone's giving you an answer, they might answer stable life or be happy or both, but you really just want one at a time. So you might just do this one, and then your next question would be about happiness in Detroit. This helps people kind of digest what you're asking them, gives them time to address each issue at once, and helps you kind of develop a richer story. So I did my focus group guide. I did about 10 focus groups, and then I'm going to show you how you analyze that type of data. All right, I'm going to stop sharing this again because I learned that you can't see it if I switch screens. Okay. So to analyze focus group data, I use a software called NVivo. And NVivo enables you to upload transcripts of focus groups, and then you get to code what people are saying. So here's a transcript from the focus group. Can you see all of it? Your faces are blocking it for me, but can you see like a full sentence over here? Okay. So here's the question that we asked. So if someone's trying to get ahead, they think they have a stable life, and they want to get ahead, what do you think a family would need? Someone said education. They said, what about a skilled trade? Definitely education is key. So what's great about this software is it enables you to sort of code what you're reading. So I highlight education here, and I add it to an education code. I'm reading about a skilled trade. Education is definitely a key point. They're kind of saying the same thing using different words, so I'm going to code that to education also. And so you do that with every single line of a focus group transcript to make sure you're capturing what residents are saying and you're basically allocating them to different themes. Oh, you guys are going to join focus groups. So this is exciting. So you actually get to be a participant. And hopefully, I'm sure that the facilitators will follow these focus group rules because we're all on the same team. So when you're coding this, you're putting them in different buckets. So I put that in an education bucket. I'm seeing here that this person is talking about, oh wow, they're talking about a lot of different things. They're talking about affordable insurance is important to live a stable life, affordable housing. So I'm going to code that to all the different themes that I see related to those things. Now, I don't see insurance here, so I'm going to add an insurance code. So you do that with the entire transcript. It takes a really long time because usually when people are talking for an hour, it's about 20 pages. And at the end of it, you have really rich data on what 6 or 7 people think about economic stability and about poverty in Detroit. So to understand, I do this with all of these focus groups. I did the same process. We had about 10 of them throughout the city. And then you go back and look at your code buckets. So the education code, I double click on this, and then you see, it's going to take a while because this is a very large code. Come on, little in vivo. Here we go. Okay, so you see across a bunch of different sources what people are saying about education. And these are people from various focus groups, various parts of the city. We also coded research articles too. So this process enables us to understand not, what everyone is thinking in this city, but it helps us to understand what different residents at different points of life are thinking in kind of a deeper way. And so when you're writing a paper about this, which is what the end goal of this exercise is, you really try to read these themes and try to kind of summarize what people are saying. So this person is saying, she has education, but she still can't get a job. And what does that mean, right? So maybe education isn't the only thing that residents are pointing out brings them economic mobility. Maybe it's something else too. So I think what I really like about focus groups is it lets people explain in their own words what's happening in their experiences. Whereas a survey, you preset what the questions are, you preset what people pick. A focus group, you'll ask them a question, but they might say, I don't like that question. I'm going to answer something totally different. And that happens all the time. Or they'll say, why did you phrase it that way? I'm like, I don't know. You tell me what you want to say about this. And so I think the key to collecting this kind of data is making sure you're not having too many questions, so you let people have the conversation they want to have. You're making sure that you're warming up the audience, and then you're also making sure that you yourself are kind of engaging. So you're friendly, you're smiling, you're nodding when people are talking, and you're not trying to kind of rephrase what they're saying, because their story is the data. So if someone told me something that I thought personally was, incorrect or offensive or whatever that might be, I wouldn't say, oh no, but you really mean to say this. I would never say that, because the idea is to get their story. Sometimes if you see that other people in the room are uncomfortable by what someone said, you might say, hey, I see you're looking a little bit, questioning Mr. Jones. Like, what did you think about what Mrs. Jones said? And so you kind of let residents talk to each other and kind of unpack challenging things together. So that's kind of another way that we collect data to understand, what residents want and what their priorities are. We use focus groups, we use surveys, and those are kind of two big ways that I do my work at Poverty Solutions. So I'm going to stop there, and yeah, I'll take some more questions.
I also typed it, but do you send your audio out to a third party to be transcribed?
Yeah, we started with asking our research assistants to transcribe, but it just way too much of their time. So yeah, there's a company that we use to transcribe the audio. I'll send it to you. They're really good, except for folks who have accents. They usually have to go over it again and make sure that what they're saying is accurate. Sometimes they don't transcribe exactly what someone says if they think the person has an accent. Obviously, we all have accents, but so that's the one drawback. But it's fast. It's much faster than a person on staff.
Cool.
Other questions, thoughts, comments?
I've got another one. I like social problems. That's why I volunteered as a staff member in this session. Why did you choose in Master of Public Policy versus like an MPA?
Yeah, so at first I was in an MPA program. I thought I was going in to grad school to kind of learn management skills, to learn more administrative skills. And then I switched midway through because I realized I didn't have all the tools that I needed. So I thought I wanted to take more classes and kind of extend my degree a little bit more. I wanted to learn a little bit more about social work, a little bit more about urban planning. So I extended my degree in part to take classes from other programs at U of M. But yeah, I think schools describe them similarly. Like, I don't think there's a really hard line between those two programs. I think they're pretty similar, especially because you have electives, you can kind of shape it how you want. So I don't think there's a huge difference between those. I think I chose an MPP versus a law degree, for example, because I realized I didn't want to practice law, but I wanted to understand more. You know, once you have the laws, they shape, you know, regulations and programs. I wanted to know more about kind of the programs and the policies and how they're implemented, less so than actually formulating laws and regulations. I mean, that's kind of how I thought of it. But I think that's, you know, another way to get at public policy that is super useful too. Same with an MBA, right? You can have an MBA and run a government agency. You can have an MBA and run a nonprofit. It's just, yeah, more about the specific kinds of skills that I was looking for at the time.
Thank you.
I just had a generalized question actually of like, when you were going into your career path, what were some of the values that you think you thought of when you were trying to go in your career path, and do you think they're like achieved right now, or at least partially worked into what you're doing?
Mm-hmm. Oh man, that's such a good question. I've never had that question before. You know, I think they've changed a little bit. When I first started, I had a general sense that I wanted to do public service work, but I didn't exactly know what values I was bringing to that. I think, you know, at the time, I probably would have said, you know, equality, democracy, things like that. I think working for the city council member that I worked for, she had a very clear sense of equity and of representing residents and having them participate in everything that you do. And so to me, I think that's a really strong value that I have now, which is you shouldn't be making policy or making programs without the voice and the participation of those who you're trying to impact. And so focus groups are one way to do that. Having residents co-design program and policy with you is one way to do that. But for me, that's really important. And so I'm always looking in our work and in kind of when I'm looking at what other agencies are doing, how did you get residents' participation in this? Did you just decide you were going to do this program or policy without asking, without inviting? And so to me, that's a really important value. And at Poverty Solutions, we spend a lot of time on that. We spend a lot of time going to meetings, talking to people, and doing kind of deep qualitative studies to understand the experiences of residents, of participants, and making sure we're translating that into our recommendation. So for me, that's a huge value. And I think it's also related to kind of racial justice too. You know, for a very long time, people who look like me were not consulted in any kind of policy making, right? And so I think in a community like Detroit, really believing in participation and believing in policy that's crafted with residents in mind is also racial justice, because most people here are people of color. And so bringing them into when you're deciding things or when you're ending something is just really important to me. So I would say those are two things that have evolved over time. But I still believe in, equality and democracy, of course, but I think how I explain it's a little bit different with more experience. And I think finding a workplace where they also have a set of values and they align with your own is really important. It's difficult to do early on in your career because you may not have as many choices of where you get to work. But I think asking that question to potential employers is so important. Like, what words are they using to describe what they do? Are they talking dismissively about residents? That would be a huge red flag for me, for example. Sometimes agencies will speak that way, and so I'll know that's not somewhere where I want to work. They don't respect residents as co-creators. So that's that. I think that's how I answer that question. Jack says, what are the steps taken to implement residents' opinions? Great question. That's that's a very tricky one. So let's say you're hearing from residents that their main priorities for spending are, parks, schools, reducing crime. So you might then want to go to each of those departments. You might want to explain to them, hey, this is something that residents are really interested in. Let's have a public meeting. You can tell residents about your plan for the next 2 years, get their input on that plan. And then you might shift course, for example, on what you're trying to do based on what residents are saying. Let's say they think, we want parks, but we actually want parks that have better lighting and basketball courts. So rather than spending a bunch of money on a park with a baseball, diamond, you might say, well, it sounds like residents want basketball. I mean, that's a very simple version of it, but it is actually what planning departments do. They have, when they're planning how neighborhoods are going to look, they have a set of public meetings. They bring a list of what they are thinking, and then they get resident feedback on what they're thinking. Now, sometimes they don't change course based on what residents are saying, and that is not a good thing. That's where the politics comes into play. But I think that the key is sort of residents early before you decide something full. Bring them in as an advisory board, do surveys, do focus groups, and then when you've made a couple of decisions, go back to them and say, hey, here's what we are thinking based on what you've said. Is this still what you're interested in? It's really hard. It's very time consuming and costs money sometimes. So it's difficult to do, but I think, especially if you're working for a public entity, like, I think it's your duty to do that. And, I think the private sector does this too. They will send surveys to customers. They will test user experience when they're doing a new app. They do the same thing. This is just the products are a little bit different in this case, right? And I think the public sector has been slower to adopt this kind of practice. Whereas, focus groups for kids' cereal have been around for 50 years, right? It's always been happening. So those are some examples, but I think there's lots of there's books, there's articles, there's lots of stuff out there that kind of help you build your toolbox in bringing in resident opinions. I just listed a few, but there's lots of different things out there.